Welcome to another boring history for sleep, a place where you can fall asleep fast while drifting through the past. Think of this as a bedtime story, or maybe even a sleep story, where strange and weird history unfolds like a gentle story time session. Some call it extra history, others call it stories for sleep. But here, you can simply relax. Let the day fade and learn history while you sleep. Whether you're looking for a sleep video, deep sleep meditation, or just the calming voice of a sleepless historian guiding you through boring history to sleep, this is your moment to rest. Every winter during England's brutal Lil Ice Age, 1 in 5 medieval peasants never saw spring again. Not because they moved away, but because their bodies literally shut down from the inside, while their minds remained fully aware, watching every moment of their slow descent into death. We're talking about a winter so harsh that people didn't just freeze. They watched their own bodies betray them, piece by piece, organ by organ. Before we dive into this frozen nightmare, smash that subscribe button if these historical survival stories fascinate you. I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Someone from Norway watched at 2 a.m. last week, which feels perfect for today's icy tale. I saw another comment from someone in Canada who said these stories help them fall asleep. Honestly, that's both terrifying and oddly fitting. Tonight, we're exploring medieval winter survival. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, grab that blanket and settle in. Pull up those covers. Because where we're going, you'll want to feel every bit of warmth you can get. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never take your heated home for granted again. It's November 1347. In a small English village during what historians call the Little Ice Age. You're a 15-year-old peasant named Thomas, and you've just woken up in what passes for your family's bedroom. But here's the thing that would shock modern people. Your entire family of 6 people sleeps in a single room that's barely 10 feet square. Your house? It's made of wattle and daub, basically sticks and mud held together with hope and prayer, topped with a thatched roof that leaks snow during the night. Your breath turns to fog the moment you open your eyes. The fire died hours ago because wood is more precious than gold in winter. Every single piece of fuel has been counted, measured, and allocated with mathematical precision. Your feet hit the packed earth floor. Not wooden planks, not even rough boards, just dirt compressed so hard it's like stone, and pain shoots up your legs like lightning bolts. This isn't the kind of cold you experience when your heating breaks down for a few hours. This is bone-deep freeze that makes your skeleton feel brittle, like it might shatter if you move too quickly. Your joints ache with a pain that seems to come from inside your bones. Your muscles feel stiff and unresponsive, as if winter has invaded your very tissues. But you have to get up anyway. The pig needs feeding, and that pig, it's literally the difference between your family living or dying before February. This isn't a pet or livestock in the modern sense. It's a walking food reserve, your family's insurance policy against starvation. Every calorie it consumes has been calculated against every calorie it will eventually provide. The village priest wasn't lying when he said winter was God's test of human faith. This cold doesn't just nip at your skin like a playful bite. It reaches straight into your bones and stays there, setting up permanent residence. Your father's voice sounds different in winter, quieter, more economical, because even speaking wastes precious energy that might mean the difference between survival and death. Here's what's absolutely wild about medieval winter survival. Your body doesn't fight the cold the same way modern people would. Instead of cranking up internal heating like a furnace, it goes into a kind of human hibernation mode. Your metabolism slows down dramatically, like a biological dimmer switch being turned way down. Your movements become deliberate and minimal. Every gesture calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum energy expenditure. You feel this strange heaviness that's deeper than ordinary sleepiness. It's your body's ancient wisdom telling you to conserve everything. Heart rate drops, breathing becomes more shallow. Even your thinking slows down to preserve energy. Medieval people called this the winter mind, and it was absolutely essential for survival. Outside your tiny window, just a wooden shutter over a gap in the wall, no glass because that's impossibly expensive. Maybe half the chimneys in the village have smoke rising from them. The rest can't afford to start their fires this early in the day. Wood rationing is so severe that some families will go entire days with nothing but body heat from humans and animals. That's not poverty in the way we understand it. That's calculated survival strategy developed over generations. Every family knows exactly how many logs they have, exactly how long those logs need to last, and exactly what temperature is the minimum required to prevent death. It's mathematics applied to mortality. The village has appointed a frost watcher whose literal job is to patrol during the deadliest hours before dawn, checking on elderly and sick villagers, making sure no fires have gone completely out, because a dead fire often meant dead people by morning. This person sacrifices their own warmth and sleep to ensure community survival, walking through brutal pre-dawn cold to tap on doors and peer through shutters. When the frost watcher calls your name, you know it's your turn for day duty. The question everyone fears asking but needs to know: anyone not wake up? Because in medieval winter, sleeping deep was often just a gentle way of saying someone had died during the night. But the real terror that haunted every medieval winter, they didn't just worry about freezing to death. Starvation was equally deadly, and every single family knew exactly, down to the day, when their food supplies would run out. This wasn't rough estimation or hopeful guessing. They counted every grain of wheat, measured every scrap of flour, rationed every turnip and onion with obsessive precision. The village grain store was sealed in a carefully constructed pit lined with clay and straw, and opening it wasn't done lightly. When Elder Harold announced the grain inspection, everyone knew what the stakes were. 20 days of food remaining, but 40 days until spring planting could begin. The math was brutal and undeniable. This is where medieval survival gets absolutely insane, and I mean that literally. These people didn't think about individual survival the way we do. The entire village operated like a single organism, with every resource shared according to complex social calculations that balanced need, contribution, age, and family status. Picture this scene: 30 people standing in the dim winter light, their breath creating clouds of vapor, shoulders hunched against cold that could kill them within hours of exposure. Elder Harold stands by the village grain pit, their emergency food store that represents the difference between community survival and mass death. When they opened that sealed pit and descended with torches to assess what remained, The wait felt eternal. Children fidgeted despite the cold. Adults maintained carefully neutral expressions, but you could see the tension in tightened jaws and crossed arms. The elders emerged with faces that told the story before any words were spoken. The announcement was delivered with medieval directness. We have grain for 20 more days at current rations, possibly 30 if we reduce further. A murmur passed through the crowd like wind through grain. Everyone could do the math. Spring was still more than 40 days away. That's when they started implementing the emergency food protocols that would make modern people sick just thinking about them. Marsh flour, made from pounded cattail roots, labor-intensive to prepare, less nutritious than grain, but it would extend the precious wheat and barley stores toward spring's arrival. But even that wasn't the bottom of the food hierarchy. When conditions got truly desperate, they turned to bark flour, literally the inner bark of certain trees, processed through techniques that had been preserved in community memory for exactly these situations. The preparation was difficult, the nutrition minimal, the taste bitter, but it could mean the difference between life and death. These weren't desperate improvisations by people who didn't know better. These were carefully preserved survival technologies, passed down through generations of ancestors who had faced similar crises. Medieval communities maintained detailed knowledge of which plants could be eaten when nothing else was available, which tree bark wouldn't poison you, how to process these emergency foods to extract every possible bit of nutrition. Medieval food procurement operated on multiple levels of desperation. First, normal crops stored from harvest. Second, preserved meats and dried vegetables. Third, emergency grains from the community pit. Fourth, foraged supplements like marsh plants and tree bark. Fifth, truly desperate measures that included boiling leather goods and grinding bones. Every level had its own techniques, its own social protocols, its own psychological implications. Moving down the hierarchy wasn't just about hunger. It was about community acknowledgement that survival had become more desperate, that normal social rules might need adjustment, that individual needs might have to surrender to group survival. But wait, here's where medieval winter survival gets even more fascinating. These people didn't sleep the way we do. Their winter rest came in two distinct chunks. First sleep from dusk until midnight, then second sleep from roughly 2 a.m. until dawn. Between them came the watch, a period of purposeful wakefulness that served essential survival functions. This wasn't insomnia or sleep disorder. This was sophisticated time management developed over centuries. While modern people panic about staying awake at night, medieval communities expected and productively used this midnight consciousness. Different families had different watch activities, but all were purposeful and necessary. During this midnight period, mothers would spin wool into thread by firelight, and I'm talking about the literal difference between having clothes and freezing to death. Medieval wool processing was incredibly sophisticated, using techniques we've mostly forgotten. They treated raw wool with urine, beat it with special tools, processed it in ways that created fabric with insulation properties that remained effective even when wet. Try surviving winter in cotton clothes that get wet, and you'd be dead by morning. But medieval wool could keep you alive even when soaked through, because the fiber structure trapped air and retained insulating properties under conditions that would make modern synthetic materials useless. Fathers used watch time to repair tools by touch and memory rather than sight, their fingers moving through familiar patterns while their minds processed the day's work and planned tomorrow's survival strategies. This wasn't leisure craft time. It was essential maintenance that could determine family survival. A broken plowshare, a damaged axe handle, a worn-out rope could mean the difference between successful spring planting and starvation. Children learned survival skills during watch hours through whispered instruction and hands-on practice. Not cute bedtime stories, but practical knowledge transfer that would determine their ability to survive future winters. How to identify edible bark, how to process cattail roots, how to maintain fires with minimal fuel, how to read weather signs that predicted dangerous storms. Medieval education happened primarily through these intimate family moments, knowledge passed directly from experienced practitioners to developing apprentices, technical skills transmitted through demonstration and repetition rather than written instruction. The sleeping arrangements were pure survival engineering. 6 people crammed onto a sleeping platform barely big enough for 3 adults, bodies arranged according to carefully calculated heat distribution patterns. The youngest child always got the middle spot, the warmest position, protected by layers of family members who formed human insulation. Everyone else arranged themselves by age, health status, and contribution to family survival. The most vulnerable were protected by those better able to withstand cold, but even the protectors were positioned to maximize group warmth while minimizing heat loss to the environment. They wore wool to bed, not the itchy, uncomfortable stuff you might imagine, but incredibly soft fabric created through processing techniques that modern textile production has largely abandoned. Medieval wool workers understood fiber structure in ways that allowed them to create materials with thermal properties that rivaled modern synthetic insulation. The family sleeping arrangement wasn't just about warmth. It was about security, social bonding, and survival psychology. Physical closeness reinforced family bonds that were literally life and death important during crisis periods. Children learned through physical proximity that they were protected, valued, essential to family survival. When someone in the village got seriously sick during winter, the entire community mobilized, not out of sentiment or religious charity, but because losing any person meant losing crucial knowledge, skills, and labor that the group couldn't afford to sacrifice. Medieval communities operated on the principle that individual survival and community survival were inseparably linked. When old Gilbert was dying, teenage boys like Thomas were assigned to death watches, sitting with the dying person through the night, learning their final words of practical wisdom, ensuring that essential knowledge wouldn't die with the individual. This wasn't morbid or traumatic, it was normal, expected, and absolutely necessary for community continuity. Gilbert used his last conscious moments to tell Thomas about field drainage techniques that could prevent flooding damage to next year's crops. Even facing death, medieval people prioritized the transfer of survival information. This wasn't sentimental. It was ensuring that generations of accumulated knowledge continued to serve community survival. The death watch served multiple functions, providing comfort to the dying person, maintaining social bonds, preventing valuable knowledge from disappearing, and teaching younger community members about mortality as a normal part of life rather than something to be feared or denied. Here's something that would absolutely shock modern sensibilities. Medieval people couldn't bury their winter dead. The ground was frozen solid from November through March, too hard for digging graves even with the best tools available. Instead, bodies were carefully washed, wrapped in their finest clothes, and stored in a special structure called the corpse shed at the village edge. This wasn't disrespectful treatment of the dead. It was practical accommodation to environmental reality. The deceased were honored through proper washing and wrapping. Their souls were believed to have already departed for the afterlife, but their physical remains had to wait for spring ground thaw before proper interment could occur. The corpse shed was built specifically for this purpose, designed to keep bodies frozen solid until burial became possible. Families would visit during winter to pay respects, but the practical aspects of death were managed with the same efficiency applied to all other survival challenges. Medieval death practices reflected their understanding that survival of the living took precedence over ceremonial treatment of the dead, while still maintaining respect and dignity for community members who had contributed to group survival during their lifetimes. Medieval winter psychology included sophisticated morale management that would impress modern behavioral scientists. Village elders carefully scheduled small feasts and celebrations at precise intervals throughout the winter. Not random indulgences, but calculated psychological interventions timed for maximum impact on community mental health. These moments of relative abundance were strategically placed just when despair might begin to break people's spirits, when the endless cold and hunger might overcome human resilience. The elders understood something profound about psychological survival. Hope needed to be rationed as carefully as physical resources. A winter feast didn't mean abundant food. It meant slightly larger portions, maybe some preserved fruit or honey, possibly a small portion of saved ale. But the psychological impact was enormous, providing proof that survival was possible, that community bonds remained strong, that spring would eventually return. Entertainment during these gatherings was participatory and communal. The best stories were ones everyone knew but still enjoyed hearing. Shared cultural touchstones that reinforced group identity and transmitted survival knowledge through memorable narratives. Medieval storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was educational technology. Stories about previous winters, about clever survival techniques, about community heroes who had overcome similar challenges. These narratives contained practical instruction disguised as engaging tales. The psychological warfare of medieval winter was absolutely relentless. Imagine knowing that each passing day brought you closer to either spring's salvation or winter's victory. Every meal you consumed might be your last. Every cold night you survived might be followed by one that killed you. Yet these communities developed entertainment, social structures, and mental frameworks that carried them through months of darkness. Medieval winter games were designed to burn off restless energy while building social bonds between villagers. Simple contests of skill and chance, stone casting, riddle solving, hand wrestling. No material prizes were awarded because nothing could be spared, but social recognition provided powerful motivation and elevated spirits. Physical games helped maintain muscle tone and flexibility during periods of enforced inactivity, while mental challenges, like riddles, kept cognitive functions sharp despite reduced caloric intake and limited stimulation. The riddle competitions were particularly sophisticated, with adults trading increasingly complex puzzles that contained multiple layers of meaning. These weren't just word games, they were exercises in lateral thinking, memory training, and cultural knowledge preservation. When major storms hit that made movement impossible for days, individual households became completely isolated islands of survival. 3 days of howling wind, snow falling so thickly it obscured houses just yards away, temperatures so low that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. During these storms, families survived by burning absolutely minimal fuel, just enough to prevent death, not enough for comfort. Bodies were kept close together for shared warmth, with every scrap of cloth and hide used for insulation. Food portions were reduced even further, a calculated risk balancing immediate hunger against potential future inability to reach food sources.
Water became a rationed resource during severe storms because reaching the village well meant risking death from exposure. Families melted snow when absolutely necessary, but knew that snowmelt provided water without the minerals and nutrients found in well water. Medieval storm survival required families to become completely self-sufficient for extended periods, relying entirely on their own preparation, their own resources, their own social cohesion to survive isolation that could easily become fatal. Children, during these storm periods, weren't just passengers waiting for rescue. They became essential contributors to family survival. Even small children had specific responsibilities, keeping chickens calm to prevent them from wasting energy, twisting rushes into lights, maintaining small tasks that freed adults for more demanding survival work.
Then came the first signs that winter's grip might be loosening. The initial sound was ice cracking on the river, distant pops and groans that could be heard even inside houses, signaling that water was beginning to reclaim its liquid nature after months of frozen stillness. This wasn't immediately good news. Broken ice created new hazards, made river crossing impossible, and could cause flooding that damaged winter food stores or undermined buildings. But it was the first physical evidence that winter's power wasn't absolute, that natural cycles continued despite human suffering. Medieval people understood seasonal change through subtle environmental cues that modern people have largely forgotten how to read. The quality of light shifting from winter's weak gray to something marginally stronger, wind patterns changing direction or intensity, animal behaviors indicating altered conditions, snowdrops pushing through the softening snow near the church weren't accidents of nature. Medieval monasteries deliberately planted early flowering bulbs near religious buildings, their appearance carefully timed to provide psychological relief, precisely when human spirits needed encouragement most. These tiny flowers, appearing while winter still held the land, represented hope made visible. After months of seeing only white, gray, and brown, even these small splashes of green and white seemed almost supernaturally vibrant to eyes starved for color and beauty. The medieval mind found profound comfort in finite measures. 3 weeks until plowing can start represented countable time, manageable duration, unlike winter's seemingly endless stretch that could overwhelm human psychological endurance. Village councils began meeting more frequently as spring approached, recalculating food supplies, adjusting work assignments, planning for transition from survival mode to productive mode. These weren't just administrative meetings, they were community psychology sessions that helped people mentally prepare for seasonal change. When village leaders announced the first spring foraging permission, access to woodland areas for hazelnuts stored by animals and early edible greens, it represented a crucial shift from desperate conservation to cautious optimism. Permission to gather wasn't abundance, but variety after months of monotonous diet. Medieval foraging wasn't casual wandering in search of food. It was sophisticated knowledge of which plants provided nutrition at different seasons, how to process potentially toxic materials into safe food, where to find cached nuts buried by woodland creatures during autumn preparation. The return of migratory birds wasn't just aesthetically pleasing. It was an essential early warning system developed over generations of careful observation. When rooks began rebuilding their nests in familiar trees, elderly women would nod with satisfaction. Rooks know. This shorthand represented centuries of accumulated pattern recognition. Different bird species returned at different times, each providing specific information about seasonal progression, weather patterns, and environmental conditions. Medieval people could predict farming schedules, flood risks, and food availability based on bird behavior with accuracy that impressed even modern wildlife scientists. Early spring foraging parties followed carefully planned routes that maximized nutrition gathering while minimizing energy expenditure. Medieval caloric calculations meant that food gathering expeditions had to yield more energy than they consumed, or they became counterproductive to survival. Hazelnut gathering involved sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior patterns, where squirrels and other creatures had cached nuts during autumn, how to identify storage sites, which nuts remained viable after winter storage, how to process nuts that had begun sprouting for maximum nutritional value. Wild greens like nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic provided essential vitamins and minerals that had been missing from winter diets for months. But gathering them required detailed understanding of plant identification, optimal harvesting times, and processing techniques that eliminated toxins while preserving nutrients. Medieval plant knowledge was encyclopedic in scope and practical precision. Community members could identify dozens of edible plants, knew which parts were safe to consume, understood how to process potentially dangerous materials through fermentation, cooking, or drying to eliminate harmful compounds. This botanical expertise wasn't academic knowledge, but survival technology passed through generations of ancestors who had tested, refined, and perfected techniques for extracting nutrition from environmental resources that untrained people wouldn't even recognize as food sources. By the time first plowing began, the village had undergone complete social reorganization in response to winter pressures. Some households had combined for efficiency, sharing resources and labor to maximize survival chances. Children had been temporarily fostered between families based on resource availability and care capacity. The elderly, who could no longer contribute essential labor, had either been supported through community resources or had died quietly during the coldest months. Not from neglect, but from the simple reality that severely limited calories had to be allocated based on survival mathematics. Medieval social flexibility allowed communities to expand and contract like living organisms responding to environmental pressure. Family boundaries became more permeable when survival demanded resource sharing, while individual needs were balanced against group survival requirements through complex social negotiations. The psychological transformation from winter survival mode to spring productivity mode wasn't instantaneous or automatic. Bodies that had remained tense even during sleep for months began to gradually relax as temperatures moderated and food security improved incrementally. Faces that had been drawn tight with constant calculation of resources, risks, and survival probabilities began to show expressions beyond mere survival focus. Not optimism exactly. Medieval people were too practical for unrealistic hope. But possibility. The mental space to consider future plans beyond immediate survival. Medieval spring recovery involved both physical and psychological rehabilitation. Bodies depleted by months of restricted calories and extreme cold needed careful rebuilding. Muscles had to be reconditioned for heavier labor. Digestive systems had to readjust to different foods and larger portions. But the mental recovery was equally important. Minds that had focused exclusively on immediate survival needs began to engage with longer-term planning, creative problem-solving, and social activities that went beyond pure necessity. Here's what absolutely fascinates me about medieval winter survival. It required both ruthless practicality and sophisticated social cooperation. Individual weakness was supported by community strength, but community strength depended entirely on individual contributions. The balance between personal needs and group survival created social dynamics we can barely imagine. These weren't primitive people struggling ignorantly against overwhelming natural forces. They were sophisticated survivors who had developed technologies, social structures, and psychological approaches perfectly adapted to environmental challenges that would completely overwhelm most modern communities within days. Medieval building techniques, for example, were specifically evolved to withstand extreme weather. Low structures that presented minimal surface area to wind, thick walls that provided insulation, steep roofs that shed snow efficiently. Every architectural detail served survival functions. Food preservation technologies were equally sophisticated. Salting, smoking, fermentation, and drying techniques that could maintain nutrition for months while preventing spoilage. Underground storage systems that maintained optimal temperature and humidity for different types of preserved food. Tool manufacturing and maintenance represented generations of accumulated knowledge about metalworking, wood selection, and design principles that maximize durability and efficiency under harsh conditions. Every agricultural implement was crafted to serve multiple functions while requiring minimal maintenance. Your medieval ancestors understood something that modern life often obscures, that human survival depends on perfect adaptation to natural cycles rather than attempted domination over environmental forces. They developed technologies and social systems that worked with seasonal patterns instead of fighting against them. Medieval communities recognized that life moves through predictable cycles of scarcity and abundance, contraction and expansion, conservation and growth. Their wisdom lay not in trying to escape these patterns, but in developing technologies, social structures, and psychological approaches that enabled not just survival,
but cultural continuity through all phases of natural cycles. As spring finally arrived and villages emerged from winter's siege, people didn't celebrate with wild abandon or wasteful consumption. Instead, they began the careful, methodical work of rebuilding, repairing winter damage to buildings and tools, preparing fields for planting, processing the accumulated knowledge of another survived season into practical applications.
Medieval recovery was as carefully planned and executed as medieval survival. Resources that had been hoarded for winter consumption were gradually reallocated to spring productivity. Labor that had been focused on mere survival began transitioning to activities that would ensure next year's preparedness. The plowing season represented both practical agriculture and symbolic renewal. Soil that had lain frozen and dormant for months was broken open to receive seeds that would grow into next year's survival foundation. This wasn't just farming. It was participation in cycles that connected human activity with cosmic order. Medieval religious understanding found profound meaning in seasonal transitions, seeing divine reassurance in spring's return after winter's trial. But this wasn't passive faith. It was active cooperation with natural forces that required human skill, knowledge, and effort to achieve successful outcomes. Because medieval people knew something that modern comfort often allows us to forget: that survival requires not just individual strength, but community cooperation. Not just physical resources, but accumulated knowledge. Not just lucky circumstances, but careful preparation and skillful adaptation to changing conditions. The medieval winter was absolutely hell on earth, a test of human endurance that pushed individuals and communities to their absolute limits. But it was hell that humans conquered through ingenuity, cooperation, and stubborn refusal to surrender to forces that seemed overwhelming. Their success wasn't guaranteed or easy or without terrible cost. Many individuals died. Some communities failed entirely. Knowledge was lost and had to be rediscovered through painful experience. But enough people survived. Enough communities endured. Enough knowledge was preserved to ensure human continuity through conditions that would break most modern societies. The medieval winter recedes into historical memory, but its lessons remain relevant. These stories aren't just fascinating glimpses into an alien past. They're examples of human capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and survival under extreme conditions that might not remain as historically distant as we assume. What survival technique from this video shocked you most? How do you think modern communities would handle similar challenges? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, because these stories of human resilience deserve to be remembered, understood, and maybe even learned from. The medieval winter was a masterpiece of survival horror, but it was horror that humans conquered through intelligence, community, and absolute refusal to give up. Their blood runs in our veins. Their resilience is our inheritance. Their knowledge waits dormant within us, ready to awaken if circumstances ever demanded. Sleep well tonight in your heated home, but remember, you carry within you the genetic and cultural legacy of people who survived conditions beyond modern imagination. That strength is still there, waiting should you ever need it.